Welcome back to the Siri Poetry Library. This is Mostly Movies, where we mostly discuss movies, mostly. Talking about some Marx Brothers movies today, two in particular, Duck Soup and A Night at the Opera. My introduction of these films came in the 80s, around the time of the birth of VHS. These films had been shown on television before, and they did have a following. However, when VHS came out, a lot of classic movies were being watched again, particularly in the library where they were more affordable than the more recent blockbuster films. I didn't know much about the Marx Brothers. I was more of a Three Stooges fan growing up because they seemed to be on TV a little bit more. Also, I was big on the Hal Roach films of Laurel and Hardy and The Little Rascals, which seemed to get more TV play on Channel 11, Channel 9. This is in New York. These are the stations that would actually lease out a lot of these films because they were a little cheaper than any of the more popular current films. Um, but it was my uncle that turned me on to the Marx Brothers. He was the one that used to get them on VHS when VHS was just becoming a thing. And again, VHS tapes at that time was mostly a rental industry. So we didn't have a lot of money to buy tapes. So what we did was we did end up getting a VCR, and we would rent a lot from the library and from little mom and pop video stores. This was just before the chains came in the mid to late 80s. And also a thing that we discovered was taping films off of TV. Um, which again, I don't think the MPA is going to come after me because these tapes are pretty much all gone by now, and everything I ever taped off of TV, I rebought in the DVD and Blu-ray era. So how I came about the Marx Brothers was the library used to have two tapes, Duck Soup and A Night at the Opera, and we would keep renting them over and over again, and that's how we became really obsessed with the Marx Brothers. And it was really just these two films at the beginning. How we ended up seeing the later films was a lot of times Channel 9 or Channel 13 would start airing them. And we'd have to stay up really late, sometimes 11:30, 12 o'clock at night, to tape Horse Feathers or Animal Crackers or any such thing like that. And I remember it was a great day when The Night at the Opera was on the $1 Million Movie, and we could tape it off of TV and then not have to go back to the library. We could just watch it over and over and over again. So this set here, the Marx Brothers Silver Screen Collection, this is the first 5 films that they did with Paramount. Before Paramount basically got really fed up with them and their antics, and sort of the contract was up, and they did not seek to renew the contract. They weren't kicked out of the studio. It wasn't that their films were not making money. On the contrary, they were making a lot of money for the studio. But they were not happy with the brothers and everything that was transpiring, which then we'll get to that in a minute, how the Marxes made the jump to MGM. But the first 5 films, you can see a real progression in their growth from the Coconuts and Animal Crackers, which are kind of like the early days of adapting Broadway, which were not really that great just yet. That wasn't really something that Hollywood got into a good rhythm with until the 40s, adapting stage shows. I mean, you did have Busby Berkeley and a few other things, but adapting stage plays, a lot of it was done in a lot of medium shot. There was a lot of stuff that you can tell played better on stage than it did on film. Film was a new art form in the 30s. It was still pretty young. So they were still finding their footing and finding ways of making the musical a viable option on screen. But then came Monkey Business, which was their first film that was not based on one of the Broadway shows. And it has its moments, and you could see that they're trying things, but it's sort of like their first film in a way, even though it's their third. Technically fourth because they had a lost film from the silent era that we're all trying to winds up in somebody's safe one day. But the next film after that, Horse Feathers, to me was the first great Marx Brothers films. It seemed like the three before were learning curves and learning experiences, and it was really Horse Feathers that was the real breakthrough. You know, that fourth film, it still holds up. It's just as good as it's definitely one of their very best films. And I think the only thing that tops it would be their next film, which is Duck Soup, which was a political satire at a time during the Depression when nobody wanted a political satire, especially since Hitler had just risen to power in Europe. And the last thing Americans really wanted to see in movies was a film about insane people running a country because they could just pick up a newspaper, which they couldn't afford to buy because the Depression was awful. But even during the Depression, the Marx Brothers films still found a way to successful. People still found a way to go to the movies. And the film was very successful. It remains one of the funniest films to this day. One of the best Marx Brothers films. It has a lot of the best set pieces, such as the peanut stand, the mirror scene, and some really big song and dance numbers towards the end. Margaret Dumont, I believe she was not in Horse Feathers or Monkey Business, so she came back. And it's funny, when she's not there, the Marx Brothers films without Margaret Dumont, you really miss her. Even the later ones that are not so great, some of the later Marx Brothers films, it's always good to have her there. Even if you're watching something like a much lesser work, like The Big Store or something like that, you're so happy that she's there. Even though you're watching this movie and you're like, well, the brothers are still funny and there's still some really funny bits in this, but I'm really watching it because I just love Groucho and I love Chico and Harpo, and I do love seeing Mark Dumont play against them. So my first view of Duck Soup, once again, was from the library, then later on TV, and I had seen it several times. The best time I had seen it was at the Film Forum in New York City with an audience, which a great comedy is so much greater with a crowd because the laughing is infectious. You know, I've seen it so many times that I'm not falling on the floor laughing at home anymore, although I was as a kid when I had first seen it. But when you see it with an audience, it's like watching it for the first time because there are some people in there that have never seen it and the reactions are really big. And jokes that you've heard a million times become funny all over again. And that was actually at a double feature at the Film Forum. It was The Beatles, A Hard Day's Night, and then Duck Soup. So we called it the Lennon and Marx double feature. So that was a good one. That was one that Duck Soup is a film, again, 1934. Almost 100 years old. It holds up better than almost any comedy that's made today. And that's definitely saying something because there's not a lot of movies from the early 30s that I watch on such a regular rotation. And it just really holds up really well, even compared to other comedies from that time. Then the next film, which we're going to cover, is A Night at the Opera, which has just been released in Blu-ray. I'm very happy about this because the other films in this big monster here, which is A Day at the Races, Room Service, At the Circus, Go West, The Big Store, and A Night in Casablanca, that's the other 6 Marx Brothers films that have not yet been released on Blu-ray. And I say that I would not rebuy them all, but I'm sure if they came out, I would definitely buy them all, particularly A Day at the Races, which I think is a really, really underrated film. I think it's really funny, and I think that it's a movie that some of the humor, of course, is not politically correct, but it's very much of its time, which is something we're going to talk about in another video about censorship and why movies from the old days should get a pass and should not be the victims of censorship or editing. Because I think that you need to understand the time and the context that a movie was made in and understand that this is not who we are as a people anymore. This isn't the type of comedy we do anymore. But at the time, this was just a joke and it wasn't trying to hurt or harm anybody. And I think people that take offense to a joke in a movie that's nearly 100 years old really have to examine themselves and say, is that really moving us forward, or is that more of a, uh, book burning in a way, let's say? Um, and again, if something offends you in a film, you don't have to watch the film. It's that simple. That's what people didn't understand about our gang comedies or some other comedic works of the period that today would seem, a little bit politically incorrect. But A Night at the Opera was one of their very best films. And again, people think of this film, this was their first film at MGM. So at this point, they were done with Paramount, or Paramount was done with them. And MGM didn't quite want them. Louis B. Mayer and other people at the studio were not thrilled that the Marx Brothers were now on the payroll. But their big benefactor was the producer Irving Thalberg, who now has an award named in his honor. He was one of the best producers in Hollywood history. He was a young man, he was a workhorse, and he was definitely the brains of the MGM operation, and one of the reasons why they really flourished in the 1930s. Unfortunately, he worked too good, and he had passed away at a very young age. I believe he was 39. But he was the one who believed in the Marx Brothers when the rest of the studio did not. And he brought them there, and they really had a respect for him. They didn't respect any of the other Hollywood types because, these are boys from New York. They'd been through the Depression. They lost a lot of money when the stock market crashed, so they needed these movies. All these films that were coming in the 30s were very, very important for them to remake their fortunes. They lost a lot of money. But they were not going to take any crap from any studio executive in Hollywood. They did listen to Thalberg, and they did follow his lead. And when he passed away after A Night at the Opera, their films were never the same. And I do like A Day at the Races. I like At the Circus. And there's moments of Go West, The Big Story, and Night in Casablanca that are pretty funny, although they have their issues. But even A Day at the Races, which I still think is a great film, kind of suffers a little bit from the loss of Thalberg. You feel like there's something missing, but you can't quite pinpoint it. But Night at the Opera is just a celebration of life. And it's basically, it's the same Marx Brothers humor in a way, but it also has this love story around it, which usually would be played out by the Marx's younger brother, Zeppo, who was not in A Night at the Opera because he quit the film business to become their manager. And that's, I think part of the issue would be that he would have to have a great range, not only as an actor, but as a singer, because the straight man, Riccardo Baroni, is basically an opera singer. So it would be very hard for Zeppo to pull that off. He did a little bit of singing in Duck Soup, a little bit of singing in Horse Feathers, but he's not exactly going to sing Giuseppe Verdi. And then Kitty Carlisle's in the film, and she plays Rosa. And their relationship is actually, it's really an interesting film because this is the first Marx Brothers film where it's not really about the Marx Brothers. The Marx Brothers story is secondary. It's really about these characters, these two leads in the opera, and the Marx Brothers just happen to inhabit the same world. And they happen to bump into each other. It's more of an ensemble piece than we've ever seen before in the Marx Brothers films. And it's the first one that really has a Hollywood three-act structure type of story, whereas the other films played fast and loose, especially Coconuts and Animal Crackers, which were more like a Broadway structure than a film structure. And then, again, the fans, a little bit of a point of contention with fans, where they acknowledge that A Night at the Opera is a great movie, but is it a great Marx Brothers movie? And as a fan that grew up in the 80s where just everything was available on VHS, on PBS, or Channel 9, I never really thought of these films as broken up into eras or really comparing one film against the other. I pretty much enjoy all of it. Maybe not Love Happy, their last film, which is not even, I don't even really consider that a Marx Brothers movie. Um, but A Night at the Opera is not as funny as Duck Soup, but I think it's a better film all round. I think that there is more of a story to it. There's more of the music is a little heavier this time, and not just the music sequences with Chico and Harpo, but music itself, the opera and the singing and all that stuff, which was not really a big part of the early Marx Brothers films. But I just think it's a beautiful film and has some of the funniest set pieces, including the stateroom scene where Groucho is forced to stay in a very tiny room on a boat. And of course, the room gets very crowded very quickly. And that's a great scene. Two hard boiled eggs. Uh, and probably the best scene in the film, which unfortunately, if you watch this film on television, the first time I saw it was on Channel 11, and an entire sequence got cut for time. You wouldn't think a movie that's not even an hour and a half would have problems with cutting, but even then, the commercials, the greed, would take over. But that's what I liked about Channel 9 because you might have had a lot of commercials, but they didn't cut a frame. And I think one of the best sequences in the movie is the room switch, which appears later on, where Groucho is trying to protect his friends that are on the run from the law. And even when the law shows up and are convinced that there's people staying in his house that are in America illegally, Groucho finds a way to sneak them out and to also drive the inspector insane. But definitely worth seeking out. I'm so glad it's finally on Blu-ray. We have to preserve these classic films because, to be honest with you, a lot of movies today, comedies, dramas, whatever, they're not doing you used to go see a movie, like you see a film like this, like A Night at the Opera, and this movie's about an hour and a half, 91 minutes, right? And in 91 minutes, it gives you so much laughter, so much spectacle, so much of everything you should get out of a movie, so much entertainment value in 90 minutes. Yet you go see these movies today, they're 2.5 hours, and it seems like they don't do anything. It seems like there's no idea of filmmaking or structure or anything of entertainment value, and they just keep making them longer and longer and longer. And I don't want to get on the comic book movies because I do love the comic book movie in principle. But I think the problem with, especially not to pick on Marvel, but they make their movies way too long. There's no reason for these movies to be 2.5 hours, 2 hours and 45 minutes. A lot of the humor is really corny and it doesn't really land. And you don't need to end every scene with a joke, especially jokes that are, I'm sorry, they're like Bob Hope humor, like they aren't really funny. There's like, for every one funny joke, there's 5 that are just thanks for the memories type jokes, really. They need to really find a way to make these movies shorter. Make them good, but make them shorter. And now we're reading about the Batman movie supposed to be 3 hours long. That's coming out in another month and a half. And you don't need to make a 3-hour Batman film. You really don't. I mean, what more can you say in this movie? Why does it have to be so long? And I know the fans don't mind, and the part of me is sort of like excited too to get a long Batman movie, but trying to sit through these movies, especially in a theater where you have to see 20 minutes of previews, then you have to have a PSA where Nicole Kidman comes out and thanks you for going to the movies again. I mean, we could really do without this. When we used to go to movies in the 80s, we used to basically sit through a couple of trivia questions. When it was showtime, you had 3 trailers. Then you had the movie. The movie was 2 hours or less. And you could still go out and enjoy your day. But because they're making movies so long, and because we have 20 minutes of previews and all PSAs thanking us for coming back to the theater, we are basically stuck in the theater all day. And that's part of the demise of movie theaters. And we've got to find a way to make people come back to the theaters. And one of the ways to do that is to get us in and get us out. Don't give us all these previews. Don't give us all the PSAs. Don't give us a 3-hour movie. Make it well, but make it shorter. All right. Thanks. Signing off.